This next piece is called Southern Jukebox Music. You know that kind of warmth that occurs at a concert. In this concert, because we had to have a live audience here. We're not just playing in a studio, and it ended up with this sort of relationship, a feeling of warmth, which ultimately, I suppose, is happily what our music generates, and that is, I suppose, in a sense, the Penguin Cafe. I wouldn't want to say that's it, limit it to that, but I would say that that's certainly a sign of the Penguin Cafe. I wasn't too clear until recently why it was penguins at all in the first place, and I think I've traced it to a documentary I saw on television, and I just remember it made a tremendous impact. It was about penguins in the Antarctic. It was very crowded, a bit like London, and there was a penguin making his nest out of stones, going away for miles, bringing stone back, putting it on his nest, going away again, and then there was another penguin in the nest next door, who, when the other one went away to get a stone, he just leaned over and take a stone out of this other one's nest. And there were two distinct characters there. And there were a lot of their behaviour. You could see somehow ourselves reflected in it somehow. And it was something to do with that, I think, in retrospect. It was something to do with seeing our original nature, how we must have been before we started thinking an awful lot and screwing things up, Well, I'd written this piece, and I was looking for a name for it. It happened that way around, and I just couldn't easily think. Normally, I come up with a title; it sort of just flips out. But I remember having quite a lot of trouble about that one, and I was going through my dictionary of music, desperately looking for sort of words and things, some idea, and Perpetuum mobile just leapt out, and it seemed to describe very nicely what it is. It's a bit serious, Perpetuum mobile. I mean, I have a slight anxiety that it's a bit sort of perpetual mobile. But in fact, I suppose I also saw that it's also said, when I looked at it, it said Perpetuum mobile, which was like Mobile in Alabama somehow. It looked like that to me. And what with our Southern jukebox music and our references in that way to something in the South, it seemed to connect it with that somehow, although it's not at all apparent by looking at it or listening to it. So that's my own kind of process. This next piece has two optional titles. You can choose between them. One is numbers 1, 2, 4, and the other one is numbers 1 to 4. Hang on. in a sense, I revolted very young against classical music. I was amusical, no musical sign at all. But when I found a guitar, that was it. There was a sort of great connection with that. And then I sort of half-heartedly went to a music college. I studied classical guitar and dropped out of the music college because of the academic, for me, the deadness of the academic teaching. This was 1968 or 9, after all. And I joined an avant-garde guitar group and got very involved in avant-garde music, which eventually I couldn't quite handle. It was a bit over-complex and didn't give me the kind of emotional thing I needed from music. And I went on looking, and I got involved in rock music a bit, and that didn't quite have the musical sophistication. I then, in the early 70s, started listening to African music a lot, which was the most inspiring thing to listen to for a long time for me. Actually, it sounded like the music of home. It sounded more familiar and more meaningful than Mozart, which is quite an odd kind of situation, but that's how it was. And I learnt a lot, or relearnt a lot, from listening to African music then. And I've ended up really discovering that what I did was, when I rejected classical music, I kind of threw the baby out with the bathwater and turned my back on actually what is really our strongest or our major tradition musically, and that is classical music. It's the major musical art form of our culture. And so, having sort of looked around the world and wished I was sort of South American or whatever, Russian or something, in fact, I'm sort of actually of this culture, and that I've come back to where I started. I'm a kind of, what would you call it, a refugee almost. And here I am in the Penguin Cafe, which is my refound home, I suppose, I mean, it's like I'm not the sort of person that writes music which is very stressful or about vigorous concept, intellectual working out of things. That's not my nature. I'm more looking for a kind of, not just sweetness either. It's not just a question of nice things. It's a question of actually things which work emotionally in all the different emotional manifestations. Somehow I'd like to sort of work around it all, because somehow it leads to more life inside, and the life inside almost gets resolved through the music sometimes, or aired anyway. Compared with Stockhausen, there's not a lot going on in our music. And I don't mean to compare us with Stockhausen sort of in any deep sense, but, you know, our music is not very complicated.